What secrets hide behind the calm waters of Lake Laros? Stay with us as we uncover the shadows beneath a seemingly perfect honeymoon, a story that starts with love and laughter, but hints at something far darker. You won't want to miss this. Lake Laros, draped in the haunting beauty of Louisiana's majestic cypress trees, seemed to belong to just the two of them. The calm waters mirrored the deep blue sky, and the old wooden cottage where Angela and Bryce Henderson were spending their honeymoon looked almost too perfect. A scene pulled straight from a romantic movie. Small and cozy, the cottage's wide porch and time-worn rocking chairs were dusted with lichen, adding an eerie charm. Angela, wrapped in a blanket, cradled a steaming cup of coffee as she watched Bryce wrestle with a stubborn fire for their barbecue. She smiled, her voice light but teasing. "First time I've ever seen you do anything with your hands." Bryce, a strong, confident man with broad shoulders and warm brown skin, turned and laughed heartily. "Well, I had to impress you with something on our first date, didn't I?" he said, winking. But as his attention returned to the reluctant flame, Angela's smile faltered. Her thoughts drifted. How little she truly knew about the man she'd married after just 6 whirlwind months. The questions, always lurking, crept back. Why did his past feel like a locked room she wasn't allowed to enter? "Tell me again how you decided to go into business," she asked, feigning casual interest. Bryce glanced over his shoulder, his expression briefly tightening. "You know I did. It was a good opportunity to invest in a startup. Wild at first, but it all went downhill from there." His words, vague and familiar, left her unsatisfied. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows over the lake. Hours later, as they finally savored tender ribs and roasted vegetables, Bryce leaned back with his wine glass. "So, what are we doing tomorrow?" he asked. Angela smirked. "Fishing? You've bragged about being a master with the rod. Time to prove it." He laughed, but the sound felt strained. "That's right. Tomorrow I'll pull out the biggest fish in the lake for you." Yet his gaze shifted, lingering on something, or someone, beyond her shoulder. The phone on the table buzzed, cutting the moment short. Bryce's face turned unreadable as he checked the screen. "Work," he muttered, already rising. Angela stayed behind, sipping her wine and letting her thoughts spiral. How often he'd been called away lately, always with some urgent business. Was it really just work? Her mind flashed back to her old life in New Orleans, her law firm, her friends, Chantal, her best friend, who'd been skeptical from the start. "You're rushing, Angela," Chantal had warned. When Bryce returned, his usual charming smile was back, erasing the tension as if nothing had happened. "Movie marathon?" he suggested. "Sure," Angela replied, though unease prickled beneath her skin like a hidden splinter. The next morning they set out for the lake, laughter masking the undercurrent of tension. Angela struggled with the fishing rod, missing bites and laughing at herself. Bryce, too, only managed to reel in a few small perch. Yet, when Angela stepped away to rest, she caught sight of him again, this time whispering into his phone behind the trees, his body language distant, his voice too low to hear. What is Bryce hiding? "I guess that's what important businessmen always do," Angela reassured herself. She caught herself thinking that she suddenly felt superfluous. There seemed to be an invisible wall stretching between them, and although their relationship was warm, this invisible line was becoming more and more tangible. Back at the cottage, Angela found an excuse to go through Bryce's things as he went to take a shower. She found nothing suspicious, just the usual papers and wallet and credit cards. But among those things were printouts of bank accounts, and she couldn't help but notice regular transfers to some company. That made her a little wary, but she decided not to jump to conclusions. Late that afternoon, sitting on the porch enjoying the fresh air, Angela asked the question that had plagued her all day. "Breeze, What are these transfers to Fillet Investments? I found the documents in your things. His face darkened for a second, then the smile returned, but less confidently. It's an old story. A friend and I tried to start a business on the side, but the project didn't take off. And now it's just there to pay off old debts. You know, business is an unpredictable thing. Angela nodded, pretending that was enough for her. She wasn't an expert in finance, but her intuition told her that something wasn't right here. Then why didn't I know about this project? She wanted to ask, but didn't, deciding it wasn't time to spoil the honeymoon. The next few days flew by in casual amusement, walked, dinners, and campfires. But the little alarm bells kept ringing, and they became harder to ignore. One evening, as they were getting ready for bed, Bryce's phone vibrated again. Angela heard him walk quietly out of the bedroom. She got out of bed and went to the door to overhear his conversation. Bryce was saying something muffled and irritated. Then she heard him say, "No, she doesn't know anything. Just make sure everything goes according to plan." Those words stuck in Angela's mind. She went back to bed and lay staring at the ceiling, realizing that it wasn't as simple as she wanted to believe. The morning started out familiarly. The smell of coffee and toast, the soft light coming through the curtains, and Bryce busily going through his things. Angela sat at the table pretending to read a book, but actually watching her husband out of the corner of her eye. He was putting some papers in his suitcase and then hid it in the closet. "Are you going to work?" she jokingly threw. "Are you going to work?" she jokingly asked. "No, just getting everything in order," he replied without raising his head. That brevity was alarming. Lately, conversations with Bryce had begun to feel like a game of one-way answers. He'd say exactly as much as he thought he needed to, and change the subject quickly. Angela could see her thoughts turning into loops, tending toward one thing. What was he hiding? At breakfast, she decided to ask a couple questions, casually, so as not to seem suspicious. "Breeze, remember when you told me about your first business? You never told me why you sold it?" He looked up, lingering his gaze on her a little longer than usual. There was too much competition. It was better to invest in something new than try to survive. His voice sounded calm, but a little strained. Angela nodded, pretending to be satisfied with the answer. Though she wanted to clarify, "Didn't it say then that you left the business because of some debts?" Bryce averted his gaze. "You seem to have misunderstood me. The debts were with the partners, not me." He stood up and headed for the exit. "I'm going for a walk." After he left, Angela put the book aside. Her intuition told her it was time to look in the suitcase he had hidden in the closet. She opened it carefully and discovered a folder of documents. Among the many pages of accounting records and contracts, the printouts of transfers to Soleil Investments, a name she'd heard before, caught her eye. Large sums of money involved, and something told her that it wasn't a simple old debt payment. When Bryce returned, Angela was sitting on the porch, trying to hide her nervousness behind a smile. "So what's on the plan for today? Another outing to the lake?" I tried to make light conversation. "Sure," he replied, but it was obvious his thoughts were preoccupied with something else. By late afternoon, the tension had peaked. After several failed attempts to get any details out of Bryce, Angela lost patience. "Why don't you ever tell me the truth? What's with all the transfers to this company?" Her voice shook as she showed him the printouts. Bryce quirmed. He took the sheets from her hands, glanced at them, and tossed them on the table. "What are you doing going through my stuff? Do you even trust me?" His tone was harsh, as if Angela had broken some invisible contract. "I do, but not when you're hiding important things." She stepped closer without taking her eyes off him. "Why are you going off the phone? Why are there amounts in these documents that you didn't tell me about?" Bryce took a muffled breath as if figuring out how to answer. It's not what you think. You don't understand how it works. These translations are part of business agreements. I don't have to fill you in on every detail. His voice grew rougher. That's not an answer. Angela clenched her fists, trying not to break into a scream. You married me, and now you're acting like I'm your subordinate, not your wife. And don't you dare pretend you're so naive, Angela. You knew I was in business, and business is no walk in the park, he said, throwing her an angry look. Then, turning abruptly, he walked out of the cottage, leaving Angela alone. She stood in the living room for a few more minutes, listening to the silence that had suddenly become as pressurizing as a slab of concrete. Sitting down on the couch, Angela covered her face with her hands, but there were no tears, only a feeling of helplessness that was overridden by determination. She wasn't going to let any more questions go unanswered. Her heart pounded as she went back to Bryce's suitcase again. This time, she took all the documents and began to study them more carefully. Almost every one of them concerned Soleil investments, with the amount in the account exceeding any reasonable limits for a normal business. Among the documents were ATM statements showing large cash withdrawals, but what struck her most was a folder labeled Soleil Development Project. Some investment project Bryce had never mentioned. Embedded in one of the documents was a letter addressed to Bryce from an unknown correspondent. It's all set. You know what to do. We'll figure it out after your vacation. There was no signature, but the content was eloquent enough. Angela felt something snap inside. Her instinct told her that these papers could be a clue to something much bigger than she suspected. 2 hours passed before Bryce returned to the cottage. He looked tired and angry. Are you still mad? He began. But Angela interrupted him, holding up the very papers. Explain this, she said coldly, showing the letter and papers. His face contorted, as if he didn't know how to get out of it anymore. You've got it all wrong. He squeezed out through gritted teeth. This is just business, Angela. You have nothing to do with these deals. But I'm your wife, am I not? She said angrily, feeling ready to explode. Or am I just a statistic in your life? You know what? Bryce replied, retreating to the door. I'd rather go out for some fresh air than listen to this. With those words, he threw the papers on the floor and left, slamming the door loudly. Alone in the cottage again, Angela contemplated what she should do next. She gathered up the papers and took them to the kitchen table to study them once more. One thought was bouncing around in her head. Bryce wasn't what he seemed. She had married him too quickly before she knew enough about him. When Bryce's cell phone vibrated on the nightstand, Angela picked it up machine quickly and looked at the screen. It was the same number she'd seen more than once when Bryce had gone to talk alone. She froze for a moment, but curiosity took over, and she answered, "Hello?" she uttered, trying to sound calm. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then a low voice came on, clearly surprised that the woman had answered, "I'm sorry. I think I have the wrong number." The voice sounded uncertain, as if the person hadn't expected to hear someone else's voice and was now looking for a way to get away from the conversation. Angela, sensing this awkwardness, quickly answered, "This is Bryce's phone. He's out right now. Who's asking?" There was now a note of confusion in the caller's voice, but he tried to hide it. "I'm from the bank. We wanted to discuss one of the transfers made recently." Angela caught the nervousness in his tone, and it didn't sound very convincing. She thought the caller was understating something or trying to cover up his real purpose. "The bank, you say? I'll tell Bryce who called," she answered, deciding not to give away her suspicions. As she hung up the phone, she felt a wave of anxiety sweep through her body. The words, "discuss one of the translations in light of the documents," she had found raised even more questions than answers. The morning began as usual, the bright sun shining through the tree crowns, illuminating every blade of grass and refreshing the cool air. Angela woke up before Bryce and was already making coffee when he, slightly sleepy, joined her in the kitchen. "Good morning, beautiful," he said as he hugged her from behind and pecked her cheek. His warm voice and soft touch seemed real, but something deep inside Angela wouldn't let go. She hid her thoughts behind a smile and tried to focus on the present moment, not thinking about the strange phone calls and suspicious documents. Bryce looked carefree, as if the past unpleasant conversations and tension of the last few days had completely dissipated from his mind. He was good-looking, slender, muscular. His dark skin contrasted nicely with his white t-shirt, and his smile has always seemed too perfect. But for Angela, that perfectness was beginning to lose its power. She sensed there was something else lurking behind that screen. After breakfast, Bryce suggested a walk in the woods. "Some fresh air," he said. Angela agreed, hoping the change of scenery would help take her mind off her worries. The path they followed was familiar, but it seemed new. A light breeze stirred the leaves, and the silence was broken only by rustles in the bushes, in the distant cries of birds. Angela walked a little ahead, stopping occasionally to listen to the sounds of nature. "It's so peaceful out here," she said, turning to Bryce, who was walking a little behind. "It's good at least we got out of the city. It helps a little to reset." Bryce nodded, but his gaze was staring off somewhere off to the side, as if he was pondering something far away. Angela felt slightly irritated. Why was he always thinking somewhere far away? It seemed like a honeymoon, the perfect moment for lovers, but there was some invisible wall between them, silent, but tangible. "Can you hear me at all?" she asked half-jokingly. "Sorry," Bryce replied with a slight smile. "I'm just thinking about business." He added, as if inadvertently, I should make a couple calls soon." Angela felt a familiar sense of unease. She would have liked to say something sharp, but held back. Not now. Not here. Things to do, she thought. Always business. Their path led through a thicket of dense shrubbery, and ahead they could see the lake. Angela, who loved nature, stepped confidently, and soon they were on the shore where it was surprisingly quiet. Even the wind died down for a moment, leaving them alone with their own thoughts. "Something about you've been getting a little too into yourself lately," Angela said, trying to approach the conversation more gently. "I realize business is stressful, but it's like you're not here." Bryce lowered his head, not answering right away. "It's not as easy as you think it is. There are things you don't understand." He glanced at her with a hint of irritation in his eyes, but quickly hid it behind a strained smile. "Well, so explain." Angela folded her arms across her chest, trying not to show how much this was starting to piss her off. "It's not like we're strangers. You can trust me?" Bryce stopped, casting a quick glance at her. "I trust you," he uttered, but his tone was far from convincing. He looked around again, as if he was searching the woods for something, or checking to see if they were actually alone. "You're acting weird." Angela decided not to be embarrassed anymore. "The calls, the papers, the money, I don't understand where it's coming from. Am I just supposed to just take it all in silently?" Bryce froze for a moment, clearly not expecting such a direct question. "It's none of your business," he replied coldly, as if defensively. Then, as if realizing the harshness of his words, he added, "I mean to say it's not something you need to worry about." "Not something to worry about. Bryce, we're married, in case you've forgotten." Angela couldn't contain her anger any longer. "I'm not somehow outsider, and if something goes wrong, I want to know." Bryce looked away again, and for a moment the silence between them was deafening. He looked again like he was somewhere far away, thoughts not here. "Okay, I'll tell you everything when the time comes. Trust me, okay?" Angela hummed incredulously and stepped aside, as if trying to take a pause in this endless conversation that was leading nowhere. She noticed a small side trail leading deeper into the woods, and suddenly she wanted to walk alone, to be alone with herself, if only for a few minutes. "I'll take that trail. I'll wait for you on the other side," she tossed over her shoulder, not waiting for Bryce's response. "What? Why? I don't think there's a good trail there," Bryce spoke, but she was already heading that way. The path was even more overgrown than she thought. The branches clung to her clothes, and she had to slow her step. After a while, stopping to catch her breath, she looked back. Bryce was standing far behind her, and his figure was already lost in the shadows of the trees. Angela stepped forward and immediately tripped over a root, losing her balance. A second, and she fell, hitting her knee on the ground. "Shit," she cursed, feeling a sharp pain in her leg. She got up, but as she looked around, she realized she didn't know how to get back up now. She couldn't hear Bryce, though he had to be somewhere nearby. Her heart hammered more frequently, but she decided there was no need to panic. "I'll go back," she muttered to herself as she headed toward where she'd last seen him. But when she reached the trail, he wasn't there. "Breeze!" she called out loudly. There was no answer. She tried to walk on again, but the forest was too confusing. Panic was beginning to rise inside, and thoughts that she might be lost began to crowd out everything else. "Bryce!" she shouted once more, but again nothing. Only the rustle of leaves and the crackling of twigs somewhere in the distance. Several hours had passed since the last time she'd spoken to Angela, when Bryce finally showed up at the cottage alone. He looked worried, but not depressed, more like focused. He immediately grabbed his cell phone and called the police. "My wife, she went into the woods and hasn't come back. I can't find her," he said, trying not to raise his voice too high so as not to arouse suspicion. The police arrived on the scene an hour later. Bryce met them on the doorstep, rubbing his hands together nervously. "We were walking in the woods, and she took a different trail, and I lost sight of her," he explained quickly, but his words sounded rehearsed, as if he'd said them several times in his head already. Detective Anthony Duval, who had arrived with the team, immediately noticed the tension in Bryce's voice. His suspicions were heightened when he began to describe events in too much detail. Duval had seen similar cases many times. The more a person tried to reproduce a picture, the more questions arose. "We'll begin the search," Duval said, circling the area with his eyes. "But I'll need your full cooperation." Bryce nodded, glancing nervously around the woods again. Detective Anthony Duval sat across from Bryce again, in the tiny living room of the cottage. The room seemed quieter than last time, as if the atmosphere itself was shrinking in anticipation of something important to happen. Bryce looked tired, but despite his fatigue, he remained calm. Duval knew he'd questioned the man before, but something told him he needed to ask the same questions again. Perhaps some small detail would change after all. "Now, Mr. Henderson," the detective began without taking his eyes off Bryce's face. "Let's go back to the last time you saw your wife. You said she went forward on the trail?" "Yes, she did." Bryce nodded, his voice sounding tired. "We were walking together, but then Angela decided to turn onto a side trail. I stopped to tie my shoelace and lost sight of her. Called out to her several times, but she didn't answer." "Did you try to follow her?" Duval clarified. "Yeah, I tried to catch up with her, but then I couldn't figure out exactly where she'd gone." Bryce pressed his lips together, as if holding back something important that might come out. Duval continued to stare at him, as if searching for something in his facial expression that would give away the lie. "And then, what did you do?" Bryce took a gulp of air before answering. "I looked for her some more, but then I realized I needed to call for help." The answers were correct, but felt rehearsed. Still, Duval knew that so far, he didn't have enough reason to question Bryce's story. The search for Angela continued all day, and it was nearing evening when the rescuers finally located the body. She was lying at the bottom of a deep cliff among sharp rocks, and her condition left no doubt that the fall had been fatal. However, experts determined that Angela had been alive for several hours after she fell, making the incident even more tragic. So far, it looked like an accident caused by carelessness in the backwoods. Duval was present at the site when the discovery was officially confirmed. He lowered his eyes and took a deep breath. In his experience, death in such conditions was often considered accidental, but something kept him going, as if one small detail kept escaping him. Later that evening, Duval found himself in a small village not far from the forest where the tragedy had occurred. Deciding to get a drink to clear his head a little, he walked into the local bar, one of those places where all the local news swirled. The bar was small, with faded posters on the walls and creaky wooden chairs. But he didn't need frills right now, just a little peace of mind. He sat down at the counter and ordered himself a whiskey. As the bartender poured him a drink, Duval overheard two men sitting at a nearby table talking. The voices were loud enough to be distinguishable. "I'm telling you, Charlie, that bridge almost fell apart a couple times while I was fixing it," said one of them, a middle-aged man with strong arms and a weathered face. "Really?" echoed his companion, a young guy tapping his fingers nervously on the table. "Well, my daughter likes to walk there. You know I'm worried, don't you?" "Of course I do. That's why I fixed it up a week ago. Strengthened it all up like it should be," the first man replied, taking a sip of his beer. Duval tensed. His hand froze on the whiskey glass. "Fixed it a week ago?" ran through his head. He stood up, turning to the two men. "Sorry to intrude," he said, stepping closer. "Are you talking about the bridge on the trail that leads through the woods to LaRose Lake?" The men looked at him in surprise. "Yes, exactly," the older man replied, frowning slightly. "I fixed it up a week ago. There were problems, but I fixed it all up." "Why do you ask?" Duval nodded, trying not to give away his tension. "Just clarifying. I need to be sure it's this bridge we're talking about. There was an accident there recently." "It is that bridge, sir," the man confirmed. "You can rest assured. I checked the fastenings. Everything was in order." Duval felt a new picture forming in his mind. If the bridge had recently been repaired and everything was fine, how could it have collapsed in such a way as to cause Angela's death? The only answer was that someone had deliberately damaged it beyond repair. Detective Duval sat at his desk at the station, surrounded by a pile of papers, printouts of bank transactions and reports. At first glance, everything looked like ordinary financial documents, but he knew there was more than just business behind those lines of numbers. He managed to gain access to the bank records associated with Bryce and Angela, and soon interesting facts began to surface. The bulk of the transfers went through Soleil Investments, the same company that Bryce had mentioned in their first conversation. However, the detective quickly realized that the structure of this company was nothing more than a screen behind which larger financial transactions were hidden. The money was deposited into accounts registered in Angela's name, but was almost immediately transferred onward to more closed offshore accounts. This gave the impression that the funds were controlled by her, but in fact they were beyond her access. Duval sighed, running through possible scenarios in his head. Marriage of convenience, he thought. Too many details indicated that Angela was nothing more than a tool in Bryce's elaborate scheme. He decided it was time to meet someone who knew her intimately enough. Chantal sat across from Duval in the small office, her hands clasped together and her gaze fixed on the floor. She looked tired, as if the past few days had taken their toll on her. "Detective, I don't know how I can help." She began raising her eyes. "But if you think I knew about any of Bryce's business, I didn't. I'm more interested in what you knew about your conversations with Angela before the wedding." Doof all set the papers aside and looked at Chantal. "What?" What's she sure about this marriage? Chantal froze for a moment, her gaze becoming more focused. To be honest, she had her doubts, she admitted. She shared with me that Bryce acted strangely at times, the way he avoided talking about his past, or how he was too closed off about finances. I told her to take it slow, but she was in love. And you know, sometimes love clouds the mind. Duval nodded as if pondering what he'd heard. Do you remember any specific things that bothered her? She told me she once found documents with confusing financial transactions. Some transfers she knew nothing about, though they seemed to be in her name. Chantal shuddered slightly, but I think she decided to just ignore it. Bryce had a way of explaining things convincingly, and she wanted to believe him. The detective could feel the puzzles starting to come together. Chantal's words confirmed what he suspected. Angela had become an unwitting participant in the financial fraud. It made him look at their marriage from a different angle. Perhaps his purpose was to hide the money. Meanwhile, the forensic results related to the bridge were also beginning to come to light. Duval had received a report that showed that the fasteners had indeed been damaged recently. This was no accident. In places where the planks were bolted to the main beams, someone had carefully loosened the bolts, causing them to collapse under the weight of a man. Given the recent repairs, it was becoming obvious that someone had purposefully set this trap. The next day, Duval called Bryce back in for questioning. This time, the atmosphere was more tense, and Bryce himself looked as if he knew something was different. Mr. Henderson, the detective began, placing the crime scene photos and copies of bank statements in front of him. It seems that we have new information. Are you aware that shortly before your wife's death, large sums of money were transferred into her name? Bryce wrinkled his nose as if in pain and quickly frowned. We've already discussed this. They were business transfers. We had joint investments. Investments, you say? Duval interjected with a slight chuckle. Did you know that all that money was diverted to offshore accounts a few days later? And did you know that the fastenings on the bridge he fell from were intentionally damaged? Bryce's face petrified for a moment, but then he found the strength to keep his composure again. That sounds like an accusation, Detective. You have no evidence that I had anything to do with this. Duval leaned toward Bryce, speaking quieter, but more clearly. Maybe not yet, but we have questions. Many questions that I'm sure you'll be able to answer thoroughly. For example, why were all the financial transactions so closely tied to your wife's name if you claimed they were your investments? Bryce jerked back, his jaw tensing slightly. It was a precautionary measure. No criminality involved. Angela knew about the transactions and was in agreement. Duval thought again, looking intently at Bryce as if solving another puzzle. I wonder if she would have agreed to it, knowing that it could have ended this way. He said, then added, Do you mind if we continue to look into the details of your business, Mr. Henderson? When the interrogation was over, Duval remained in his office, immersed in his thoughts. More and more signs were pointing to the fact that Angela's death had not been an accident. The financial schemes, the damaged bridge, the doubts she'd had before the wedding, all of it was adding up. But there was still a lack of direct evidence. He decided to visit Chantal again to clarify some points. Upon meeting her, she already seemed calmer than last time, but still remained wary. Chantal, I need you to tell me how Angela reacted to those documents she found. She discussed it with you in more detail, didn't she? Yes. She said she wanted to go to a lawyer, but changed her mind at the last minute, Chantal replied. Bryce assured her that it was just a temporary mix-up, and everything would be resolved soon. And she believed him? I think she did. Or wanted to believe him. She loved him very much, and didn't want her suspicions to ruin everything. Well, Duval sighed. Sometimes love really does cloud the mind. The detective left Chantal knowing that the story was beginning to take shape into something bigger, but he needed to find the last piece of the puzzle. the evidence that would show that the marriage was nothing more than a convenient cover for financial fraud and murder. Duval sat at his desk, once again going over all the available evidence, as if trying to piece together a complex puzzle. With each new piece, the picture looked more and more like an elaborate scam. Bryce was using Angela as a cover to hide his machinations. It was clear as day. However, direct evidence of his involvement in her death was still lacking. Financial transaction reports, account statements, and Saleh investment documents lay before him like clues to some complex puzzle. Bryce's every move was well thought out. Money transferred to Angela's accounts would immediately go offshore, making it almost elusive. For anyone else, it would have been the perfect crime, but Duval wasn't about to give up. He decided to revisit the surveillance footage from the bank through which the transfers had been made. As he scrutinized the footage, he noticed a small detail. A few days before the tragedy, Bryce had entered the bank with Angela. At first glance, it didn't seem to make much difference, but Duval caught something odd in their behavior. Angela looked tense, as if something was bothering her. Bryce, on the other hand, seemed overly calm, more like the confidence of a man who knew everything was going according to his plan. The next day, the detective decided to talk to the bank clerk who was working that day. Duval hoped the clerk would remember some detail that might shed some light on their visit. "Can you tell me exactly what the conversation was about when they came here?" Duval asked, holding up pictures of Angela and Bryce. The clerk, a young guy with a tired face, shrugged. "I honestly don't remember everything. I think it was about some kind of transfer that was to go from their joint account to Mrs. Henderson. He insisted that she be present for it. It seemed strange to me. Usually such things are done without too much formality. Why did it strike you as odd?" With raised eyebrows, Duval clarified. She seemed, how shall I put it, unsure, like she wasn't fully aware of what was going on. The clerk replied, frowning slightly. "Fully aware of what was going on?" The clerk replied, frowning slightly. Mr. Henderson, on the other hand, spoke calmly, as if he knew in advance that everything was going to be all right. This confirmed Duval's suspicions. Bryce was using Angela to disguise his criminal activities. The marriage was nothing more than a screen to hide his machinations. All indications were that Angela had begun to suspect something and was probably about to tell the truth, but didn't have the time. This forced Bryce to act, quickly and decisively. Meanwhile, the forensic results of the forensic analysis of the bridge fasteners were on the detective's desk. The experts confirmed that the fasteners had been loosened by hand. In the places where the bolts should have been tightened to the stop, there were signs of recent manipulation, as if someone had loosened them, but tried to do it discreetly. All indications were that it had been done to create an emergency situation. Duval leaned back in his chair, pondering his findings. All the strings were coming together now. Financial fraud, using Angela as a cover, a weakened bridge. But for a full-fledged indictment, something more was needed, something that would directly link Bryce to the bridge damage. That evening, Duval decided to talk to Chantal one more time. Perhaps she knew something that might answer the questions that still remained unanswered. Chantal met him wearily, as if she was afraid to hear what he was about to say. "Chantal, have you ever heard Angela mention any dangers on the trail where the tragedy occurred? Perhaps she noticed something strange about the bridge or its condition," Duval asked. Chantal hesitated, as if trying to remember something important. "You know," she said after a pause, "Angela was telling me a couple weeks ago that Bryce was suggesting that she avoid that trail, said the bridge was old and might not be safe, but she always replied that it was fine, and she enjoyed walking there. She even joked that Bryce was too overprotective." Those words struck the detective's head like a bolt of lightning. Bryce had been preparing the ground in advance to direct Angela exactly where he would set a death trap. It gave him the opportunity to avert suspicion from himself in advance. If anyone later learned of his warnings, it would only confirm his version of the accident. The next day, Duval went to the workshop where the man who repaired the bridge worked. This workshop serviced all the surrounding forest trails, and this was where the bridge had been serviced just a week before the tragedy. The detective hoped to find something to help figure out who might have had access to the vandalized fixtures that were used for the repairs. The workshop wasn't too big, but it smelled of machine oil and wood resin. There were tools hanging on the walls, neatly arranged on shelves, and in the corner was an old workbench stacked with miscellaneous parts. When Duval entered, a stout man in a greasy sweatshirt, the same foreman who had repaired the bridge, came out. "Detective, what can I do for you?" he asked, wiping his hands with a rag. "I need to clarify something about the repair of the bridge at Lake LaRose." "Did you have it serviced?" Duval began. The form had nodded. "Yes, that's my job. It did have some problems with the fasteners, but I reinforced everything properly. There were anti-vandal bolts on that bridge. They weren't easy to damage." "And what? The bolts were completely replaced?" Duval clarified, looking intently at the foreman. "Yes, we put in new fasteners, so the bridge should be able to withstand even a serious load." The foreman looked around, as if trying to find confirmation of his words in the surrounding tools. "Tell me, did anyone else have access to the anti-vandal keys? Someone on staff, for example?" Duval asked. The foreman hesitated. "Actually, there are only 2 keys. One in my possession and one in the supervisor's. But you know, I once saw Bryce Henderson, the husband of the deceased, talking to one of our guys. He was interested in the repairs and even asked me to show him how the anti-vandal key worked." The words of the handyman confirmed the detective's hunch. Bryce had inquired about the fasteners on the bridge shortly before the tragedy, which was too much of a coincidence to ignore. Duval continued checking and discovered that one of the employees was indeed acquainted with Bryce. The one said that Bryce was supposedly interested in the safety of the forest trails, motivated by concern for his wife's safety. But now, after talking to the foreman, that concern looked suspicious. Duval learned that Bryce had even taken the worker's anti-vandal key to see how it worked. It looked like an attempt to learn how the fasteners could be loosened so it wouldn't look suspicious. The detective had to spend a few more days gathering circumstantial evidence, but he was soon able to find evidence that the anti-vandal key had indeed been used in the bridge area the day before Angela's death. There were still marks on the fasteners that were too new for such an old bridge, as if someone had recently touched them. Duval had just about all the evidence he needed to convict Bryce. Financial fraud, using Angela as a cover, deliberately damaging the bridge. It all pointed to a carefully planned murder disguised as an accident. When the detective showed up at Bryce's house, he knew it was payback time. Without waiting for an invitation, Duval entered the living room where Bryce was standing at the window, looking out at the street. He turned around and a look of some cold calm flashed in his eyes, as if he had anticipated this moment in advance. "Bryce Henderson, you're under arrest on suspicion of your wife's murder," Duval said, holding the warrant in his hand. Bryce hummed and lowered himself calmly into the chair, as if he'd been expecting just that. "I knew you'd try to pin it all on me, detective, but you have no direct evidence." Duval sat across from him, crossing his arms over his chest. "We have witnesses who confirmed that you were interested in the anti-vandal mounts. There are signs of manipulation on the bridge, and there are records of financial machinations that indicate your marriage was nothing more than a means to cover up crimes. You don't think that's enough?" Bryce shook his head, as if he couldn't believe it had really come to this. "Maybe I really did make business mistakes. Maybe the money was transferred into Angela's name, but that doesn't mean I wanted to kill her. It doesn't." Duval nodded. "But except that before the tragedy, you warned her not to go down that trail and told people the bridge wasn't safe. That's a lot of coincidences, don't you think?" Bryce looked at the detective without uttering a word, and only in his eyes flashed something that could be mistaken for regret or realization of his own mistake. "You know, Mr. Henderson," said Duval, rising, "even the most perfect plans have their flaws. In your case, it was one bolt too well secured that you forgot to loosen." Duval cuffed Bryce, and the man did not resist. It was over. His elaborate scheme had fallen apart because of one small mistake. Several weeks had passed since his arrest, and Bryce had spent all that time in solitary confinement. He didn't know what to expect next, other than a trial that seemed to have already doomed him to the inevitable. But today's visit was unexpected. When the guard opened the cell door and announced a visitor, Bryce looked up. Standing in the doorway was Chantal. She entered leisurely, sat down in the chair opposite, and interlocking her fingers looked at him for a long time. There was something strange in her gaze, a mixture of anger, frustration, and something else Bryce couldn't quite pinpoint. "What do you want?" he asked coldly. Chantal grinned, but there was no joy in her grin. "You think I've come to sympathize?" she replied, looking him straight in the eye. "Trust me, that's the last thing I'd want to do right now." Bryce leaned back on the hard bunk and turned away, as if he didn't want to meet her gaze. "Then why are you here?" Chantal was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I just wanted to look into the eyes of the man who thought he could get rid of Angela so easily." There was an icy tinge to her voice that chilled him to the bone. Bryce turned his head toward her again. This time his eyes filled with anger. "You don't know anything. It's none of your business." "None of my business?" Chantal squinted, her face contorted with pain and contempt. "You made it my business the moment you decided to use her as a cover for your machinations. You thought she was too naive to realize what you were up to, but she was starting to figure it out, Bryce. And maybe that's what ruined you." She rose from her chair, ready to leave, but stopped suddenly and turned to him again. "You know what the ironic thing is? Angela always believed the best in people, even people like you. And I just hoped that one day her eyes would be opened. Too bad she paid too high a price for that." Bryce couldn't find the words again. His jaw tensed, and something resembling pain flashed in his eyes. Chantal lingered at the door, turning to Bryce, and her face lit up for a moment with that strange mixture of anger and cold calm that could be more frightening than rage. She took a step back in his direction, leaned on the door jamb, and said quietly, but distinctly, "Breeze, have you heard that life is such a thing that you can never guess where payback awaits you?" Bryce felt a twinge in his chest, but tried not to let it show. He just stared at her, trying to figure out where she was going with this. Chantal smiled with the edge of her lips, but there was nothing warm about that smile. "And here's something else." She continued, tilting her head slightly. "Don't forget that I'm a good shot." She paused for a moment so he could get a feel for what she was saying. "You thought it was over, didn't you? That you'd won, but no. You'll still have days to remember that there may be another reckoning. And when it comes, will you be ready for it?" There was not a shadow of doubt in her eyes, not a hint of pity. Chantal turned and walked out of the cell, leaving Bryce sitting on the bunk and staring into empty space. There was more than a threat in her words. It was a promise that payback would find him sooner or later, and she would stand there when it did. Thank you for being with us until this video. Please like the video to support us and send it to your friends. If you are interested in true crime videos, be sure to subscribe to our channel and be sure to press the bell so you don't miss the next videos.